Today we're going to move out of Photoshop and into InDesign. And so I'll start talking through InDesign. We'll spend a couple weeks on InDesign and then we'll move into Illustrator. You get the idea. Being a quarter of the way through the semester, you see that we have to kind of move. And I think it's important for two things. One, to acknowledge that, of course, you could spend a whole semester or a whole year learning just Photoshop. But we don't have that kind of time. So hopefully we got some good stuff out of Photoshop. That being said, it doesn't mean that we can just forget everything about Photoshop and never touch it again. So I'm assuming at this point that when you go, let's take today's example, when you're going to do your album artwork, when you pick your background image, you'll take it into Photoshop and you do all the post-processing techniques to make it the best possible image, and then you use it in Illustrator. So it's assuming that you're going to continue using Photoshop just as a supplement to the next software package. We will come back to Photoshop later on in the semester. You'll find that the further along in the semester that goes along, the more we'll use all the programs at once. So we keep building, but we need to get into the basics of it. So the next couple lectures that I'll give are really more about graphic design. And they're centered around graphic design because InDesign is built for graphic designers. That doesn't mean that what I talk about doesn't globally apply to all the design fields. And so I think this is a good moment for those of you that are interested in architecture to take a step back and say, hey, guess what? There is more to design than just architecture. Likewise, those of you that are industrial design students, you could say, well, wait a minute, there is more to design. So this is something that everybody's a little bit more uncomfortable with. But at the same time, it's really about how you present yourself and how you present your ideas, which is really, really important, no matter what design field you're in. So I'd start by asking a question. What is the function of graphic design and why is it important? You know, if I were to summarize it, I'd say it's the communication of messages through the juxtaposition of words and pictures. It's a little bit more of a technical definition, but what you guys said is essentially the same thing. So I'm trying to communicate something graphically and visually through the use of design, which basically sounds like all the rest of the design fields if you really stop and think about it. It's the visual synthesis of thought. So when we come to design objectives, this is just some up here. We could throw out all these without too much trouble. But basically we're trying to guide people. Maybe we're trying to persuade people. Maybe we're trying to encourage people to do something. Maybe it's just about communication. We're trying to explain something clearly. Maybe we're trying to motivate somebody to do something or educate somebody in some particular field. Those are all valid reasons to be pursuing design. Those are all valid objectives of this kind of design. And like I said, that's not an end-all list. That we could go on and come up with more. Establishing function. So what is the purpose of design? This is purely related to graphic design, though it can apply to any of the design fields. When we stop and think about it, what is the purpose of the design? It could be a poster. It could be doing an invitation. It could be doing a card. It could be doing a book. It could be doing a whole bunch of different things. You need to know what that is. Also, what is the primary objective behind this? If somebody hires you to do a piece of graphic design, you need to understand. Let's take the poster. You guys for assignment 103 are all going to end up doing a poster. What's the purpose of that poster? What's to get somebody to come to the lecture series. So you as the designer have to understand what the purpose is. Otherwise, how can you design for that particular purpose? What's the objective? Who is the audience? Who are you trying to reach with this in the first place? If you're designing a poster for a lecture series that's here at DVC, it's obvious that you'd be trying to reach the students to come to the lecture series. That might be very different if you were designing a big billboard that went on the side of the highway. So understanding who your audience is also a very critical component to doing good quality graphic design. And ultimately, what is the desired reaction? Again, I'm beating on this lecture series poster because I think it's a pertinent example. But what's the desired reaction? You see the poster, you decide to go to the lecture series. It sounds so obvious when I sit up here and talk about it. But at the same time, if you don't stop and consider it, you'll miss out on a lot of this graphic design part. It's the designer's responsibility to create strong communicative experiences that support the function of design on behalf of the client and for the viewer. So this has a lot of stuff written into it. So it's our responsibility as the designer to create a strong experience that support the function of the design on behalf of the client. So on behalf of the client, that is, who's asking you to do the design in the first place? Who are you doing this design for? It could be for you. You're doing your own portfolio. I'm the designer, I'm doing it for me. It could be somebody else. Maybe I'm doing it for the ACE Club. Maybe I'm doing it for any variety of people that are hiring you to do it. That person is not necessarily the intended audience. It's not necessarily the viewer. Sometimes you do graphic design for somebody. Sometimes you do design for some specific person. But it's not always the same. And it's important to note that there's a distinction there between who is the client and who is ultimately using it. I'll use a parallel in the world of architecture. Let's say that you were hired by a city to design a museum. Okay? The client in this case is the city who's hired you to design and ultimately build this museum. The viewer is the person who's going to go to the museum. So you're building it for one person, or you're working with one person to build it for somebody else. Does that make sense? So it's always important to keep that in balance and to understand what those mean. Designer skills. Again, this is a list that we could all come up with these kinds of things, but I'll highlight a few important ones. One is analysis. You're going to have to figure these things out and think through a lot of variables and how you want to present ideas. Another really important one is research. Understanding the field, understanding what it is you're being asked to do, understanding what's already been done in that field, and then applying it. And I'll go into some of this stuff a little bit more in depth later on. Problem solving, critical thinking, information gathering, all of these are important. So let's talk for a while about something called inspiration. And I threw up the definition here so that we could talk a little bit about the definition because I think it's interesting. It's the process of being mentally stimulated to do or feel something, especially to do something creative. Okay, sounds good to me. Could also be a sudden, brilliant, creative, or timely idea. Okay, all that sounds pretty good. I think down here at the very bottom, though, it's pretty interesting. Under origin, from Middle English, divine guidance. The idea that suddenly something pops into your head and you're inspired and you create something incredible. It's not quite that easy. It'd be nice if it was that easy. You have to cultivate this inspiration. You have to be aware of your surroundings. You have to build it in yourself. And I think the single biggest thing that you can do, and it's probably the hardest thing that you can do, is that you can be aware of what's going on around you. It's so easy to get focused on, I got to get to school. For example, you guys all woke up this morning and you said, why did I sign up for a 7:55 a.m. class? Right? I know you all thought that when your alarm went off this morning. I don't know, maybe not every single one of you. I woke up and said, why do I teach this class in the first place? So it happens. And the natural reaction is, okay, I can make it. Let me just get in the car. I'll drive here. Okay, I'm here. And you're kind of half asleep. You missed the whole journey from getting out of bed all the way through getting to class here. And I can tell you right now that there was something on that journey that would have been inspiring. And it can be something completely silly. There was one time I went up, I have to walk up on campus to get my copies in the morning. So I'm here early, I review my lecture notes, I start walking up, and it was the right time of day, and the sun was at exactly the right angle, and it was shining exactly perpendicular to all the pavement. And it made all the little ridges stand out. It was so cool. And it made me start thinking about textures of ground and whatever. If I had just been focused on, I got to get up and get my copy, I would have missed that completely. You know, when I walked out of workout this morning, the clouds were different in the sky. I'm going, oh, well, it's supposed to be a hot day. I wonder what those clouds mean. I was aware of the surroundings. That's a big factor in this. And so when you want to become a designer, you want to think about those things. You want to look at all the little details all the time, because those are the things that are going to inspire you later on. They're going to give you that inspiration later on. So number one, be aware of your surroundings. It's so important. Inspiration is found and transformed into tangible objects. So you find inspiration. It's not something that you just have these reserves of inspiration like, oh, guess what? Today I need some inspiration. I'm going to use some. It doesn't work that way. You have to cultivate it. You have to keep thinking about stuff. You have to find things that you're interested in, and then when you need it, it'll be there for you. It's different for everyone, even if you share the exact same experiences. So let's use an example here, okay? Madison, Prem, and I all go to a Rick Joy lecture. And you guys are like, who's Rick Joy? Guess what? When I drop a name like that, it's probably worth looking it up. Okay? So we all go to a Rick Joy lecture, and he talks about how his forms of his buildings help define a certain view corridor. As you work through a building, there's a pinch point, and then suddenly something expands. Okay, and we're all there, and we all listen to the same lecture. The three of us all have different things that we're interested in. We have different backgrounds. We have different experiences. And so when we come out of that lecture, I think it's pretty likely that all three of us would be inspired, but each one of us would have been inspired by something different. So even though the topic of his lecture was about how his buildings, form and frame up landscape views and whatever, I might have been really interested in the fact that he uses Corten and been thinking about how does it expand and contract versus the foundations. You might have had something completely different. You might have liked the location. You might have liked the colors he uses, whatever it is. You have a different experience. You're inspired by something different than somebody else. And I think it's important to note that your inspiration is not the same as somebody else's. Heck, one of you might not even like Rick Joy. That's okay too. That's part of this whole experience, and that's part of the design field in general. It shouldn't be a chore or require extra effort. You're here, you're a designer, you want to be here and do this stuff. Great. Let's cultivate it. It comes from a desire to create or to communicate, and you're all here and you all have that desire right now. So you already have the first steps for it. Don't forget to look inward and tap your own creative inspiration. If there's something that you like to do, let's say you really like to paint, or you really like to photograph things, or you really like to, draw, sketch, you name it. Do that. You really like to play music, compose music. Do it. That will help you through that process. Collect. When you see things that you like, collect them into some place that you visit frequently. And I'm not saying like, oh, I go home to my house frequently. I'm saying something that you carry with you that you look at frequently. So a sketchbook is a perfect example. How many people actually carry a sketchbook? So few of you. My heart hurts. You have your phone, that's good. Guess what? That's the way life works now. So if you have your phone or your iPad, that kind of counts. So the thing about it is you need a place to put stuff that you're inspired by, because you're not going to remember all of these things. The good news is you all carry a camera with you all the time now. In the old days, it used to be hard. You'd carry a big, bulky camera around and be dorky, and you would Now, we all have it in our phones. So when you see something, you see that light as it casts along the sidewalk or whatever, bend down, take a picture of it. Remember it. It's a really easy way of doing it. So that got a lot easier. Drawing, writing notes, that's still a little bit harder. It's still really important for you as a designer to learn to do that. And the more you practice, the easier it will become. And if you do it electronically on your iPad, that's totally fine. But you need to be able to record and draw and think through things and draw details. I miss the days where I had time to do that. Nurturing inspiration. So you carry that notebook and you carry that camera with you because that'll help you. You draw things, you stick things in it, etc. You become immersed in design. I think one of the great things about design school is you're all around other people who are interested in design. They're all doing interesting things. They're all looking at interesting things. They're saying, hey, did you see this? Did you look at that? That's a really good way of starting and nurturing this inspiration because you're around other people that are interested in the same kinds of things as you. So take advantage of that. When you get out in the real world, you're not around all those people all the time. And it's harder. Part of the reason I like to come teach is because I'm around all of you. And that helps me be inspired. Commit to discovering and collecting inspirational factors. This is that being aware of your surroundings sort of thing. Communicate with other designers. You're all with each other. Talk to each other about design. Hey, did you see this? That's important. If you feel like you're getting stuck and you're not getting inspired, Do something else. Take a walk. You'd be surprised how much a walk can help. There's also other weird things like go brush your teeth. I don't know. It always worked for me. If you get really tired and you're lacking inspiration, go brush your teeth and it suddenly wakes you up somehow. I don't know. It worked for me. Listen to music. What music actually inspires you to do something? Okay, so side story about music. Sometimes there's just music that helps, and you can't explain why it helps. It might not even be music that you like or would listen to again. So when it came time to write my master's thesis at Berkeley, you do this whole big project. You finish your big presentation. It's a giant wall worth of drawings and whatever. And you get done, and it's actually the earliest of all the presentations in the spring semester. And when you get done, you have 3 weeks left to write your master's thesis, your paper that goes along with all the work that you did. So the master's thesis is usually somewhere between 80 and 300 pages. So it's an intense, rather long document. Frequently, people that graduate will go on deferment, and they won't finish until later on. They'll take an extra 3 months to write the paper and whatever. I was done. And I was like, I need to get this done. I want to be out of school. Like, I'm done. So I would come in, and I've always been a morning person, which doesn't work with the world of architecture. For whatever reason, I just am backwards. But I was a morning person, so I would come in really early. I'd get into studio at like 4:30 or 5. I'd get into studio. I'd sit down at my computer. I'd face away from everybody else so I wasn't seeing anybody. I'd put a hood up. I'd put headphones on. This was back when you didn't have earbuds. They were like the big things. And I'd put headphones on, and I'd turn on some music. And guess what I wrote my entire master's thesis to? The theme song from the Pirates of the Caribbean.
Ooh, yes.
Go figure. I can't tell you why that worked. I have no idea. I don't even like it. I don't go back and listen to it. But at that time, it suddenly helped the words flow out of me. And so I would sit there and I would type away. And I would sit there for hours and type away. I don't know. It worked. So be aware that that kind of a thing can really, really help you. And don't be embarrassed to admit it. And just go for it. The good news is now you don't have to let anybody else know what you're listening to. You put your earbuds in and they have no idea. It's okay. So you can do that. Attend conferences, lectures, other events. There's a lecture series here. Go to the lectures. See what other designers are talking about. The more exposure you have to designers, the better off you're going to be. Inspiration is always the first step toward the final design. I just think it's entertaining. Anybody read this book? It's a great book. But I really like the cover. That's what I showed it for. It's not about the content of the book. It's a good illustration of quality graphic design. So let's talk a little bit about the design process. And interestingly enough, this is going to be related to graphic design, but this is almost identical to all the rest of the design processes, whether you're in architecture or industrial design. It's basically the same thing. We start with research, then we move into information gathering, brainstorming, conceptualization, experimentation, design development, and ultimately the final execution. I'll go into all of these in more detail. A couple notes about the design process. You can't skip steps. It doesn't work. You can think, oh, I'm just going to jump toward this. You'll jump, you'll do it, and you'll have somebody look at it, and they'll ask you questions that you forgot to think about, and you'll have to go back and start again. It's always the nature of it. Design is an evolution. You have to do the first step to move on to the second step. You have to do the second step to move on to the third step. Every one of those steps informs the previous steps, which is part of why you can't skip forward. Every step needs to have your full attention. You need to wake up in the morning and think about design. You need to think about design when you're taking a shower. You need to think about the design when you're having dinner. You need to think about the design when you're going to bed. Basically, you always need to be thinking about design. Can it be exhausting? Absolutely. Is it totally rewarding? You bet. And that's part of what this field is about. We put in all these extra hours. I think, I remember having friends that would say, why on earth are you an architecture major? Like, you never sleep. And I'd be like, yeah, but I get to build models all day and draw. You have to write papers. Oh, I would never want to do that. So sometimes it's just a matter of perspective. It takes extra work, but look at what we get out of it. So the project brief, this is where we start this design process. This is the very beginning of it. It should be a meticulous overview of what the project is. And I say it should be because it's not always. And that's a problem. It should address the design in detail and every aspect of the problem. What is it that you're trying to solve? It should define the roles of who the designer is, who the client is, and who the viewer is. So those three things are really important. We need to begin with the information that's given to you by the client. Okay? So sometimes this information is very thorough, and sometimes this information is really, really vague. Okay? So let's say, Manny, let's say that you came to me and you said, I want you to, and I'm using an architectural design because it's more of a personal thing here. Let's say you said, I want a new kitchen. I'd be like, okay, that sounds good. Let's do a new kitchen. I'll design it and we'll go from there. If you didn't give me any more information than I want a new kitchen, I might say, hey, you know what? Manny's a great chef. I'm going to build him a 4,000 square foot kitchen with industrial appliances and whatever. And I might do all this design work, and then I come back to you and I say, hey, look at this awesome kitchen that I did for you. And you said, but wait a minute. I don't like to cook, and I don't have the budget for that. Those are two really important questions. So as the designer, as the person who's in charge of the design, I need to say, when Manny says, I want a new kitchen, I need to say, that's awesome. Let's talk about what you want in your kitchen. Let's talk about what your budget is for your kitchen. Let's talk about those questions so that we have more information at the beginning. And it's really critical to have that information early on. So you need to clarify and simplify that information for your use so that you're clear about what's wanted and what's needed. You, the designer, are responsible for asking the questions. You can't just rely on the client to tell you everything. So make sure you're the one asking questions and filling in those missing pieces. Define the primary goals and the messages that you want to express. Define restrictions. There's always restrictions. Budget. Ugh, nobody likes budget, right? Money's always important, unfortunately. Maybe in the graphic design realm, maybe you can only afford to print in black and white. Well, if you can only afford to print in black and white, that changes the design a lot. Maybe you can only design on certain size piece of paper. That changes things. So understand what those restrictions are. Then define the timetable for completion. How long do I have to work on this? That's a really important one. And then who is the audience? Who am I trying to reach with this particular design project? Then we move into gathering. We collect all the textual and visual elements to be used. We look at those things and we say, is there anything missing? Am I missing the key photograph? Am I missing the blurb about the lecture series that explains what it's about? Am I missing who's going to come and what dates they're going to come? All of those things. If I'm missing any pieces, I need to go get those pieces. That's an important component. If those pieces don't exist, you have to find out who's going to create them. Is it your responsibility or is it somebody else's? Then we move into this information gathering phase. And this is the fun part, I think. You, as the designer, suddenly get to become an expert in some field. If somebody asks you, as an industrial design student, to come up with a new speaker design, suddenly you have to figure out what exists out there. What speakers are out there? What's a good speaker? What's a bad speaker? Those are all important things. If they say, come up with a new cell phone case, well, guess what? I need to know what cell phone cases are out there. What do they look like? How do they work? You get to become an expert. So you do a lot of research on this particular topic. Read, evaluate, understand all the provided materials. So if somebody's giving you stuff to work with, let's say you're doing that lecture series poster, read about the architects who are coming. Understand who they are. It's all good, important background information. Independently research any additional information. Is there anything else about this that we need to go through? Review the client's current communication materials. This is very specific for when you're designing for a company and they have a certain way of presenting information. So I could take DVC, for example. If I'm going to do something like, let's say I'm going to write you guys a letter of recommendation. There are certain requirements on my end about what letterhead that letter of recommendation goes on, what color green the DVC logo has to be. There's a set of design guidelines that say this is what it needs to look like. This is what it needs to be. So I need to make sure that I'm reviewing that before I go and create the document, even though I might be better at creating the Diablo Valley College letterhead than they are. But I don't get that option. Investigate competitive markets. What else is going on in the same field? Who else is doing things relating to this? We'll spend a lot of time when we do the logo designs doing that. Brainstorming. This depends whether it's more on the graphic design sense or if it's on architectural design or whatever. It's specific to the type of design you're doing as to whether it's going to be more mind maps and writing or more kind of getting ideas, disassociated ideas together, putting down details and working through there. Visual inspiration boards are always good here. Things that you like that are relevant, kind of pulling those together. Sketching, real good. Conceptualization. This is where we get into the formulation of the plan for the design, where we really get into the design itself. This is my strategy for how I'm going to attack this. This is what I'm going to try to do. This is the thematic link between the design and the function and the delivery. This is how I tie it all together and get that idea of moving forward. Then we get into design development or experimentation. This is where we already have the main idea of the design. This is where we throw out the details. We work through the different treatments. We talk about typography. What do the fonts look like? What are my layouts looking like? All of those things. Vary the sequence. Try something different. Introducing graphic shapes. All of those are ways of altering and manipulating and evolving the design. So we're trying and experimenting and working through those different ideas. And then we get into the execution. It's where we look at all the stuff that we've done and we start paring it down and saying, this is the right one. This is the one that looks best. This is the one I want to move forward with. So we get that final detail. Then we examine those details and we divorce ourselves from attachment. This is probably the hardest thing that you as a design student will ever have to do. Right there. And so what do I mean by divorce from attachment? When you work really hard on something, you become attached to it. You spend hours building that architectural model for your 121 class. You fold those planes so carefully, they're perfectly folded planes. Right? You work through those details. You go into the presentation, and the guest reviewer comes in, and they say, oh, it'd be so much better if you did this. And they tear it apart. If it hasn't happened to you yet, it will. I promise it will. When you're attached to it, the moment that person says, it would be better if, rip. If you're attached to it, you freak out and you stop learning. And you stop thinking about anything and you are like, oh, what did you do? That's really easy to do because you're attached to it. When it comes time to present your project, whether you're presenting to a client, whether you're presenting to a review panel, you need to step back from being attached to that particular project. You need to listen and you need to learn. The people that are coming into review are trying to help you become a better designer. They're trying to show you things you didn't think of. They're not doing it maliciously to tear apart your model just for the fun of it. Though there are some people that get into the show of it. But generally speaking, they're trying to help you. There's a reason that they're doing it. If you're designing for your client, you get to the presentation, you go to show them that presentation, and they say, you know, I just don't feel good about this. You as the designer don't get to say, yeah, but it's the way we're going to do it. Guess what? They're the client. So you need to listen to them. You need to not be attached to the design. You need to be able to step back from it. And it's really, really hard. And I know it is, especially as a young designer. You get better at it as you go along. Take a step back, take a deep breath, and listen to what they have to say. It's really important. You analyze it then. You take a step back, you analyze what went wrong, what worked, what didn't work. The design will be better because of it. Go back and review the project brief. Remember that was the document that said this is what the project's about? Did you actually solve what you were trying to solve? Did you achieve what you were trying to achieve? It's a good way of evaluating it. And then you get to where you produce the final draft of the project. Intuition, trusting your inner voice. So this is the other half of the lecture today. You can learn all the design fundamentals, but you still have to trust your intuition to be a good designer. Good comprehension of the techniques does not mean it's good design. And I'm going to refresh your memories and go back to this. Remember this from lecture 103? Both of these follow the rule of thirds perfectly. One is good, one is not so good. If the rule of thirds was programmed into a computer program, and it said, make sure that the main subject of a photo falls on one of the 1/3 lines, you'd get examples like the one on the right that don't work, that aren't good composition. So the computer, in this case, understands the technique. It's programmed in. This is the technique you use. But it doesn't mean that it's good. You as the designer have to trust that intuition and say, the one on the left is good, the one on the right is not. You have to be able to do that. It's a different level of thinking. It's the complement to rational thought. So there's these things that you're focused and you're thinking and they're consciously in your foreground, this is what I'm working on. And then there's this thing that's floating around in the back of your head. Some people talk about it as like a little person standing on your shoulder saying, that's a bad idea. Or that's a good idea. Yeah, do that, do that. It's that thing behind that's kind of generally guiding you. It takes time to trust that. It comes naturally, and you can't force it. As soon as you try to force it, it becomes rational thought, in which case it doesn't work anymore. It's the rational side of things. It allows for thoughts that wouldn't come out of a rational thought process. These are the ideas that just randomly are floating around in there. You're taking a shower and you come up with like, oh, that would be a good idea. It's that background chatter. Intuitive functions. General guidance. I'm generally going in the right direction. That's a good thing. Protection. Oh, that's a bad idea. It could be telling you that. It can help with the inspiration side of things. It can help with the enlightenment. It really cultivates your imagination. It allows you as the designer to move outside of your comfort zone. And that's a really important thing. It's easy as a designer to be safe. It's easy to do the safe thing. It's easy to do the thing that you've already done and been successful at. It's much harder to take that step off the edge and say, I'm going to do this. Right? The best thing that you can do as a designer is to do the risky thing. And the best professors out there will be the ones that reward you for it. So I can tell you right now in this class, and I can't speak for the other professors out there, but in this class, you have so many opportunities to protect yourself that there's no reason not to take that leap. I won't punish you for taking the leap. Your end product might suck. But guess what? You have regrades built in. You can always go back and do the safe one. Take the risk. Take the leap. It's worth it as a designer. When you're sitting there and you're nervous about, I don't know if this is going to work out, but if it does, boy, is it going to be awesome. That's the best place to be as a designer. It leads to the fresh and innovative solutions. It leads to the new ideas. We've all seen the same things over and over again. The architecture that gets recognized, the industrial design that gets recognized is the stuff that's a leap forward that somebody didn't already do. If, for example, in what was it? It was about 2007. If Apple had, and I should go look up these things. There were rumors that Apple was going to come out with a phone. And there were people that would come up with, this is what Apple's phone was going to look like. And they all looked like phones from the time. They didn't look like an iPhone, they looked like phones. And so if Apple had done the safe thing and said, I want to come out with a phone, I'm going to look at the best products that are available from Nokia and whoever else made phones back in that day, and I'm going to make one that's kind of the same thing but slightly better, we wouldn't have an iPhone. We wouldn't have touchscreen phones the way we do today. It's because Johnny Ives and Steve Jobs decided to take the leap and trust that it was the right leap to take. That's really, really important. It increases the number of ideas that you have because you're willing to take those steps and to take those leaps. It provides that spark to push the design forward. If you ever feel like you're stuck, that intuition is going to help you get unstuck and move on and move forward. The challenges of intuition. You have to allow that to surface without worrying about the final product. You have to say, hey, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe I should push that forward. It might not work out, but it also might be relevant down the road for something else. So you might push an idea forward, and it doesn't really fit in ultimately with what you're trying to do, but it might fit in next time or the time after that. So it's not worth it to just prejudge it and abandon it. It takes time to believe that your instincts are valuable. That's very true. You all have good instincts. You just aren't willing to trust them just yet. Don't prejudge or abandon an idea without allowing it to mature. So don't say, oh, that's stupid. That's never going to work. See if you can make it work. It's not always useful or appropriate. Sometimes it's out there and you're like, no, that's not quite right. That's true. I think one of the things about intuition that's hard is that it's something that when you're not trained to trust it, you end up just saying, no, that's dumb. I'm just going to stick with what's safe. And those people that have been in the design field longer, we have a tendency to listen for that intuition and to trust that intuition a lot more. And so you guys have probably been in a review, and you've had a reviewer say, there's something off about this. It doesn't feel right. That right there is that designer's intuition. They're looking at it, and they're trying to figure out how to articulate why it doesn't feel right, but they can judge that something doesn't feel right. The other thing, the flip side of the coin, is when they really get excited about something, their intuition is going, oh, this is such a great idea. Can't wait to talk about it. This is so good. Because there's something intuitive that's driving that. And that's really important to understand and to listen for in yourself, because it exists there as well. Expect the unexpected. Don't overanalyze it. As soon as you start to overanalyze it, it becomes rational thought. Just let it sit there in the back of your mind. Record those thoughts and collect the visuals as you go through it. Elevate your design. In the design process, there are things that you think about rationally, those that you learn about, and those that you're looking for. And then there is the most interesting part you cannot be rational about. You just feel it for some strange reason. Intuition, right there. If you feel it right, it will fit into the concept perfectly and make everything more intriguing and unique. So true. So true. It's a vital component to the design process. So, today in your exercise, we're going to do album covers of your favorite artist. It doesn't even have to be your favorite artist, of an artist. And I think this is always kind of entertaining because people come up with great ideas. There's a lot of artists out there, but I couldn't make you guys go design album covers without showing you a bunch of album covers because that's what life is about. So I tried to pick album covers that cover a broad spectrum of music. I recognize that everybody has different tastes in music. Look at these not so much as who the artist is, but look at them as album covers. Look at how they're combining certain elements. Look at what's interesting, what's not interesting. Look at what colors are being used. This is your inspiration period for doing your album covers. Get inspired by these various album covers. Some of them are completely iconic. Some of them are interesting. Some of them are weird. It's the nature of an album cover. Remember, if we go back and we think about what's the purpose of an album cover? What's the purpose of an album cover? Get people to buy the album. Get people to listen to the album. Attract attention. That's what the album cover is all about. That's why we care about it in the first place. Different artists can get your attention in different ways. I have to say, this is probably one of my favorite album covers. It's totally ridiculous. Did it grab my attention? Yeah, it did. That's an important factor in an album cover. Sometimes artists do 2 album covers for related albums. And so I'll use this as an example. This is his regular album. Then he did an acoustic version. 2 album covers, similar, but slightly different. So a lot of these don't take a lot of time to explain. I'm just throwing them up there so that you guys get different backgrounds, different ideas. Notice a theme there with all the black and white images? So there's certainly a precedent for this series of images, or that series of album covers. All of you could do this album cover today without a problem. It's not that hard. I don't think this is the most inspiring album. I don't think I would pick it off the shelf and want to read it and listen to it, but might work for some people. I had to throw this up there for my wife. Yeah, she grew up in the 80s. So, yeah, we'll move on. Anybody go to this? No? Well, you didn't go to this one. So, another one of my favorite albums, totally unrelated to any of the rest of the music that I listen to. This is an album by Metallica. It's called The Symphony of Metallica. They did it in about 1999. They played with the San Francisco Symphony. They played for 2 nights. And that was it. They made an album of it. It's one of their better albums, in my opinion. And to hear the combination of the symphony and Metallica is just a really interesting experience. So Chase Center just opened where the Warriors are going to play in San Francisco. Metallica came back with the San Francisco Symphony 20 years later and did it again. And that was about a month ago. So I didn't get to go. I wasn't part of the fan club. I know somebody who went and said it was absolutely incredible. So for whatever it's worth, maybe listen to it. Maybe not. I don't know. Might inspire you. That's a pretty iconic album cover. Sometimes they're kind of creative. This one's interesting. I'm intrigued by that. I had to throw this out there too. I couldn't resist. So does this scream early 90s or what? But if you really stop and look graphically, it's kind of interesting. Compositionally, it's kind of interesting. You might not choose to listen to it, but it's still interesting. Another side note, this shows you my taste in music is very broad. I went and saw him when he came back. He hadn't toured in 17 years, and he came back. I saw him in Sacramento. I don't know, it might have been one of the best concerts I've ever been to. It was ridiculous, but I've never seen somebody so into being there playing music. He absolutely loved every minute of playing in that show. So, for what it's worth, throw it out there. You go from that to this. There's such a diverse set of album covers that are out there. You can really see that there's a lot of flexibility. So I tried to update for a little bit more current. So we'll go through some of the more current selections here. I'm very intrigued by this. I've never listened to the album, but I'm intrigued by the cover. Interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and open up InDesign to start. We've been opening Photoshop. Next to it is InDesign. So we'll let that open up here. There we go. And so when it first comes up, we need to create something new. So I'll go ahead and click on the Create New button here. And when this comes up, we have a variety of options. There's probably a letter size as your recent. If we come over, we have something called Print. And under this tab, we have a variety of different sizes, one of which is compact disc. That's the size we're going to use today. But there are also web sizes, depending on what you wanted to create. There's mobile sizes, etc. So these are set up for certain size working zones. Most of what you're going to be doing is probably letter or tabloid, which would be 11 by 17. Today's, we're going to come down here and click on the compact disc size right there. Over here under the preset details, the units for this compact disc, 28p4.157, probably doesn't mean much to you guys. In true graphic terms, this is a unit called a pica, which is a graphic design layout unit. If you were working for a magazine, for example, using InDesign, they would work in picas.
that means absolutely nothing to me. And I have no idea what the translation is. So for me personally, I like to change the units into inches so that I can see what the sizes are. Now, obviously, compact disc size is a little weird. It doesn't matter for our purposes today. But I just want you to be aware that you can change the units here. I'll show you how to change them after the fact, too. But I'm going to switch those into inches. This is a square document. But if we had a letter size document, for example, we could switch from portrait to landscape here. There is also a checkbox for something called a facing page. We'll get to this when we get to the portfolios later in this section. Facing pages are like a book. When you have 2 pages and you open those 2 pages and they both have stuff on them, that's a facing page. And so you could set up that kind of a layout in InDesign, which is great for a book type document. For our purposes today, it's just 1 page, so it doesn't make any difference whether you check it or uncheck it. We'll come down here. The rest of these options are all fine. I will talk about bleed and slug later on in the semester, so we'll have an understanding of what that is. For today, it doesn't matter. And I'll go ahead and click on Create. So that then creates my document that I'm going to work on. There's this little blue ribbon that probably shows up at the bottom of the page. And do you want to use Photoshop shortcuts or Illustrator shortcuts? If you get really into using shortcuts, you can customize this depending on which one you want. I usually click on Illustrator because InDesign is closer to Illustrator in my world, but that's a personal preference. And I tend not to use shortcuts when I'm in front of you guys anyway because I don't want you to not know what I'm pressing as I work. So let's talk about the InDesign interface a little bit. It is an Adobe product, so it seems and looks kind of similar to Photoshop, which is the way it should be. We have our typical file menu structure across the top, which looks very similar to Photoshop. Below that is a contextual ribbon that will change based on what command is selected. We have our standard tools running down the left side. Those tools are slightly different than Photoshop. Couple tools of note. There are 2 different selection tools in InDesign and also in Illustrator, for what it's worth. There is something called a direct selection tool and a regular selection tool. For our purposes today, we'll be working with the black arrow or the regular selection tool. I'll explain the direct selection a little bit later on. There is a text tool that has a T on it. As you come down a little bit further, there's a rectangle with an X through it. And that is called the frame tool, or the rectangular frame tool. We're going to use that a little bit later today. I'll come back, but there's a free transform tool, also another one that's important. And then I'm going to come down to where the colors are. And in Photoshop, we had a foreground color and a background color. InDesign and Illustrator work a little bit differently. We have a fill color and what's called a stroke color. The stroke color is essentially an outline. Obviously, my voice is starting to go. Sorry about that. So if I were to create something right now, it would have no fill color, no field color, but it would have an outline that is black. So just something to be aware of. Okay? We have our document that's in this page. Pressing Control-0 will fill the page with our document, which it did by default. Our rulers are a little bit interesting in that they start at this upper left corner, and they go positive in one direction and negative in the other direction. And if I were to move the page, the rulers move too. So the rulers are attached to the document, not attached to the workspace. So 0, 0 is that upper corner right there. On the right side here, we have some other little windows that will open. We'll spend more time working with these later on in the class. There's a window for pages that can open. We're only working with 1 page today, so it doesn't matter. There are layers, much like in the world of Photoshop. The big difference between layers in InDesign and Illustrator versus layers in Photoshop sorry, is that you can have more than 1 object on a layer in InDesign, and in Photoshop you can only have 1 object on a layer. So it's a little bit different. I'll get to links in just a second. Stroke is the outline. Contains information about the outline. Color is about color, etc. Links. So this is another big thing for you guys to understand about InDesign. So InDesign is fundamentally a referenced system. So when we bring something into InDesign, we're not copying something in and it's permanently in our InDesign file. InDesign works by referencing other files. So whether it's a text file, like a Word document, whether it's a photograph, whether it's, I don't know what else it would be, some kind of graphic or whatever, all of those are referenced objects. We say, take this object and put it here. And InDesign says, great, I'll do that when I do an export. Otherwise, I'm going to show you a little preview of what that might look like. But when I go to do the export, I need to know where the original file is. So your file organization at this point in the semester becomes critical. So if you download something, a photograph, for example, and put it on the desktop, and you forget to save that photograph onto your flash drive, and the computer restarts, and you come back on Wednesday, and you open up your album cover again, and you don't have that photograph, it won't be able to do the export with the photograph in it. So you have to save the original files and the InDesign files. You can think of the InDesign files as just kind of like an organization scheme. This is how I want to put the stuff on the page. All the stuff exists over here. And so that's available in this links menu. And we'll see that once I bring something in. This Creative Commons libraries thing, we can minimize over to the side. It's not doing much for us right now. OK, so as I look at my page, the white space here is the actual page. That's what I'm working with. The gray space is off the page. So if an object falls off the page, when I do the export, it's going to get cut off, because all we see is the document itself. There are also these purple and pink lines that are set a ½ an inch in on my document. These are what InDesign calls margins. They mean absolutely nothing. They're completely arbitrary. So we can ignore them, or we can actually change them. If I go up to the File menu and I go to Document Setup, never mind, it's not there. It's under Layout, Margins, and Columns. My bad. If I go to Layout and Margins and Columns here, I could set the margins to be at 0, which essentially would mean that it's going to be a full bleed. There's a little chain that locks all of them at the same value. So if I change 1, for example, they'll all change. So I only have to change 1 to 0, and they'll all change to 0. And that essentially puts the margins at the edge, so it's not distracting us anymore. So once again, that's under Layout, Margins, and Columns. And I set the margins to 0. And I'll say OK. The other thing that I told you, I would tell you, if you happen to not change the units until you created the document, it's not a problem. If you come to where the two rulers meet and you right-click, you could change the units really quickly there into any of the other units that you want. OK, so now it's time to start creating the album cover in the first place. And so if we were going to create an album cover, we would need some album artwork in the first place. So likewise, I would pick a Creative Commons search, or maybe the Unsplash website, again, thanks to Nick, as a background image for what it is that I was trying to do. Obviously, I'd have to pick my artist first. That would be important. And for the fun of it, I'll do Garth Brooks. Why not? And so then I need some kind of a background image for his new album. And so since it's going to be a country album, maybe it needs to be some kind of grass field or farm or something like that. And so I would find some kind of enjoyable image. And so we'd scroll through here a little bit. I don't think the elephant's the right move. You know, maybe it's something like that. And I'll go ahead and download that image. There it is. Let's show it in its folder. And like I said, I'm not going to leave this file on the computer. I'm going to make sure that I copy that over into today's folder. So I'm going to right-click and say Copy. I'll move to my OneDrive into today's folder. Let me do a new folder for this semester, spring of 2019. How about 2019, not 2109? I'm not that old yet. And then we'll go ahead and click Paste here. I'll right-click and paste, and there it is. So then I need to bring that image that I just found into this document. And And I'm going to do that using the rectangular frame tool. So over here on the left side, there's a rectangle with an X in it. And essentially what that is it's giving me a place to put an image. So if I drag a box there, this is going to act like a placeholder for an image until I put an image into it. And so it exists, if I use the black selection tool here, it exists as this rectangle with an X on it. If I select that rectangle and then go up to the File menu and choose Place, right there, and when I do that, I'm going to go find that original photograph. So I'll go into my live demonstrations folder here, and I'll go into today's folder. There it is. There's my image. And I'll go ahead and click on Open. And when I do that, it drops the image into the frame that I created. So the image is bigger than the frame by a lot. And so now that I'm here, I have some options in terms of seeing it. So the first thing is if I right-click, I can go to something called Fitting. And this is something that I would encourage you to get very familiar with. We have a couple different options, and I'm going to walk through all of those. Fill frame proportionally means it's going to fill the entire frame that I have with the image, but it's going to cut off parts of the image. So the whole frame will be full, but if the image is not the same aspect ratio as my frame, some of the image is going to hang off either side. So let me go ahead and fill frame proportionally, and there it is. Looks pretty good. If I were to, I'm going to click on the direct select here just so you can see it. This orange border is the whole image underneath my frame. So technically, I have an image that goes all the way from there over to there. But because my frame is a different aspect ratio, I'm only seeing this part of the image. Another option, I'm going to back up here for a second. Right-click, Fitting, Fit Content Proportionally. This is going to fit the entire image inside of the frame, even if there's blank space at the top and the bottom. So I'll get the whole image inside the frame, but I end up with these blank pieces on either side. So it's a little bit different. If I right-click and go to Fitting, I can fit frame to content. That's going to make the frame bigger. So if I do that, we'll get the whole image. If I right-click and go to Fitting, Fit Content to Frame, it's going to fit everything inside of the image, which doesn't look too bad, but if we look closely, it essentially squished the image to fit inside. A couple more options here in Fitting. We have Centering the Content, and we can clear the frame fitting options if we wanted to. So I'm going to go ahead and fill the frame proportionally, this first option here. There it is. Now what if I really wanted the frame to be a little bit bigger? Well, I can take the frame and I can make the frame bigger. And I'm seeing more of the image here, but I'm losing the image here. Let me go ahead and drag each end of this to be the whole size of my album cover there. And I'll go back to right-click, and I'll go to Fitting, and I'll go to Fill Frame Proportionally. So I can keep doing it as many times as I want to. If I double-click on the image, I'll get into the selection of the image behind the frame, in which case I can move the image and get the composition right for my album cover. Maybe something like that. So this image, right, is now placed into this scene. It's a reasonable quality version of this image. Sometimes you'll place an image and it'll look blurry. And I get this question a lot. Well, wait a minute, why is the image blurry? When that happens, InDesign is giving us a preview of the image, not a full resolution version of the image. And so to get the full resolution version, we'll right-click on the image, we'll go to Display Performance, and we've got Fast Display, Typical Display, and High Quality Display. The High Quality Display will give us a full resolution version of the image so we can see it in all its glory. The Fast Display will give us a X, a gray rectangle. So imagine for a second that you had a 150-page document that was full of images. That would be a heavy document. There's a lot of content there. And you wanted to be able to flip through and check the text. And you didn't want to concentrate on the images. You could switch your display performance to this fast quality display because you didn't need to see all the images. Alternatively, if you wanted to see the high resolution version of all the images, you could switch over to the high quality display, and that would give us the highest quality version of the images in preview. So right here, we can come over to my windows here, and I can click on links. Remember, we had links open before, and when I click on links, you can actually see that I have a link directly to that file. That's where it's going to get the full information. So if I edited this file, it would update in InDesign. So let's try that for a second. I'm going to go ahead and go find that file. Let me make sure I get the actual one here. Okay, let's take this one. I'm going to right click and say open with. Oh, really? You're not going to include Photoshop there? Sometimes. So let's say I took this photo here. I said, you know what? I really wanted this to be in black and white. I'd go in and I'd go into my layer, new adjustment layer. I'd go to my channel mixer. Say, OK, we're going to convert this to monochrome. I'd go through my various options. Yeah, OK, that's the way I want it to look. Where's my preset here? Trying to lighten up the sky there a little bit. OK, that's great. I'm going to go to File, Save As. I'm going to put it in the same place, and I'm going to save it as a JPEG, so it's the same file type, same name. I'll go ahead and click on Save. Yes, replace it. Yep, all that's good. So this is black and white now. If I go back to InDesign, we can look here in the links, and there's a little triangle. It says something's changed. Do I want to update it? Double click to update. If I double click, guess what? It converts to black and white. So it's tied to that file. So if I make changes to that file, it will automatically update in my InDesign file. So now that I have that established, it's time to bring in some more content. So like I said, this was going to be a Garth Brooks album. So in the world of Garth Brooks, he has a little logo. So I should probably go find a Garth Brooks logo. So I'm just going to do an image search because it's probably copywritten here. So here's a nice Garth Brooks logo. I can go ahead and visit that, and I could download it. There it is. So let me go ahead and show it again, and I'm going to copy that and put it into today's folder. So notice that every time I'm taking the effort of copying the file and making sure it's organized so that I don't lose it. So I would then paste this right there. So I'd come back to InDesign, and I'd say, OK, let me create another frame. So let me come to the Frame tool here. I'll go here. I want to place that image in. I'll go to File, and then Place. And I'll say, OK, I want to drop this in. There it is. I'll right-click, and I'll say Fitting. And let's fill frame proportionally. Let's fit content proportionally so I get the whole thing. And then I could come back to my direct select, and I could move this over and kind of crop it down a little bit. OK. So that's nice. But the problem is that I'm getting the solid white background, and I really don't want that. So here's another opportunity to change this in Photoshop. So the first thing that I do is I go into Photoshop. Let's open up that file. There it is. I'll open it. And so I could just invert the image. So black and white change. So let me try that. I'll go to Image, Adjustments, and then Invert. It's also Control-I. That gives us a white on black, which would be fine. Now, could I delete the black? Sure. I can go into a color selection. I'm going to show you two ways of doing this. I'm going to select color range. I'm going to pick the black. Let me right-click and say Layer from Background so that when I press the Delete key, it goes away. That leaves me with just the white. and then I could do a save. So I could go to File, Save As. In this case, I'd have to save it as a PNG file to preserve the transparency. So I'll make sure I choose PNG and then save. So in this scenario, the background would stay transparent. The alternative, though, would be once I've inverted the file here, I could do just a file save. So this is a JPEG. There we go. Yes, I want to replace it. Perfect. All right. So again, the little triangle shows up. Do I want to update it? Yes, I want to update it. Double click. There it is. So that's just the black version. So with the PNG, I could go to File and then Place. I could drop the PNG in. I'll right-click and say Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. There it is. And it would have a transparent background. Right, same thing. Alternatively, though, remember we did blending modes in Photoshop? Well, guess what? Blending modes exist in InDesign as well. So with that selected, let me go ahead and view my transparency. I'm going to go to Window, and then, hold on a second, where is it? Gotta love it when I can't find what I'm looking for. I don't think it's under color. Sorry, it's under Effects. There we go. So it's under Effects. So I went to Window and then Effects, right there to show that. And then with the Effects window open here, there's my blending mode. So just like in Photoshop, I can switch from normal. Instead of being in multiply, we're going to go to the next likely option, which would be screen. And it's going to be showing through the white, or showing through the black in that scenario. So I'm getting just that. Looks like it's still showing a little bit, which means that this probably wasn't purely black. I'm just showing you that that exists as an option. So in this scenario, this was probably the better option to make the PNG, but I wanted to at least point that out. Let me go ahead and get rid of that frame, and we'll stick with this one. Go ahead and move this over there. Now, if I wanted this logo to get a little bit bigger, I can't just grab the sides and make the frame bigger, because it's not going to change the content underneath. Instead, I have to come to this tool, which is like a rectangle with a bunch of dots on it and a little cursor. That's the Free Transform tool. When I have that tool selected, I can actually make the object bigger. I'm going to hold down Shift to keep it in proportion, and I can make the object bigger. So I have that established. Now let's say that Garth decided he was going to need parental guidance on this album. We would need to go find that. So I'd go back into my search here, and we do parental advisory logo. There we go. And so I could pick any one of these. It would be fine. Let me right-click and say Save Image As. And again, I'm going to put it on my flash drive in today's folder. That is not today's folder. And we'll go ahead and drop that one in. Perfect. And now I can bring that in as well. So again, I'll start with the frame. I'll go to File and then Place. I'll choose the parental advisory and say Open. There it is. It's too big, so I'll right-click and say Fitting. We're going to fill frame proportionally, like that. Actually, I was pretty close to what the aspect ratio was. Let me go to Fitting, Fit Frame to Content. There we go. So I get the exact size. And then we can move this over Sorry. Oh, come on. Sorry, I was doing the Mac shortcuts instead of the Windows shortcuts. There we go. Stop. No. There we go. And I could move this over. If I wanted the size to be a little bit smaller, I could use my free transform tool. We could shrink that down. I'm holding down Shift to keep that in proportion. And there we go. I can create that. So you guys are free to pick whatever artist you want, whatever album you want. It usually takes a little bit of Photoshop work, a little bit of InDesign work. If you wanted to actually put your own text in, so let's say the album name, you would go up to the text tool, the type tool, and you're going to create a text box that your text is going to go in. There it is. We'll spend a whole lecture talking about type. We'll call it the fence. Right now it's black text, so I need to come up here and I need to change a few things. One, the size needs to get a little bit bigger. Make it a little bit bigger than that. Two, the color needs to change. So right now it's black, and we look here on our fill color is black. If I want to change that, I'll double click on it, change the color to white. That essentially means I need to go to the upper corner and then all the way up to this value here. And that then creates the text here. If I don't like the font, I can select it and then choose from the list of system fonts to be a different font. In that case, it made it a little bit too big, so we'll shrink it down like that. Okay? So your job today is to just experiment with this, create the album cover. When you're done creating it, you're going to do two things. One, you're going to save the InDesign file, which is the INDD file. So I'll go to File and then Save. And this then creates the InDesign file. I'll go to my folder for today. Oops. And I'll click Save. This would allow me to open it back up. There are some times where InDesign gets really cranky about talking to other versions of InDesign. The hope is that the version that's on these computers is close enough to the one that's on your home computer, if you have it, to talk nicely. If you have CS6, the Creative Cloud version does not talk to CS6. They get really cranky with each other. So just be aware that sometimes you can have issues with file types. So I've saved the InDesign file. This would allow us to open the layout again. Once I'm done there, I'm going to go to File and then Export. This is going to create the JPEG version. Typically, coming out of InDesign, we would be creating lots of PDFs because that's a typical output. In our purposes, we're going to create a JPEG for today. So I'm going to change the Save As type from Adobe PDF down to JPEG. And once I've done that, I'll go ahead and click on Save. It brings up the Export JPEG options here. It is important that we change the quality up to maximum and the resolution to be at 300 instead of 72. If you leave it at 72, it will be too small. So we'll go up to 300, and the rest of the options are just fine. And I'll go ahead and click on Export. And that will then build the JPEG file of this. If you wanted to see a preview without the little boxes that are containing the objects, you can go up to the View menu and choose Screen Mode Preview instead of Screen Mode Normal, and that will take all the boxes away and let us look at it as if it were a final product. Sometimes people find that useful to double check. So once again, that was under the View menu, and that was under Screen Mode, and I switched from Normal to Preview. So we'll go back to Normal, and we can see the boxes and the margins and that sort of thing. OK, so I'm going to let you guys work and kind of get your feet wet with this. We will continue with InDesign next class, so there'll be lots more of InDesign work, and I'll talk you through that at that point.